Are you ready to be famous, by the way, Karl?
I mean, sure.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Thoughts. My name is Jasmine Hunt.
And my name is Hamish Stewart.
And today on the show we have Karl Adam, a PhD candidate at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, with interests in political and social philosophy.
Today on the show, we talk about his dissertation, which is a study of how the history of settler colonialism affects the contemporary philosophy of immigration. In particular, we discuss his republicanist argument and how Western philosophy could be more inclusive.
So, here are some thoughts on settler colonialism and border control.
So, Karl, your dissertation is about the implications for the philosophy of immigration and political philosophy more generally of settler colonialism. What was the argument exactly that you gave?
Oh, thanks. So the argument, in short, is something like this. The current debate in the philosophy of immigration is carried out thinking really only about the contemporary US and Europe. And when you think about the contemporary US, we do that in a way that ignores the fact that it's a settler society. And this means that a lot of the arguments people make, especially for open borders, have really problematic implications if we think about other times and places, so especially in settler colonial contexts. And so what I try to do is come up with an argument to show why we can have a sort of middle ground in between the open borders position that fails to allow us to see the wrongs of settler colonialism in the past and now, and also the kind of arguments that I think go too far on the other side and have problematic implications for the rights of, say, immigrants to Europe and the US today.
So, could you give us some examples of settler colonialism then?
Sure. So the kinds of cases that I know most about and talk most about are issues of settler colonialism in what's now the US and Canada. The sort of pattern that repeatedly happened was that European immigrants would show up, and originally there would be very few of them. And so the indigenous people would allow them to set up a sort of a beachhead. This happened in, say, Jamestown or Plymouth and other places as well. And then the population would, over time, expand. And after a while, it got large enough that it became militarily dominant. And then often what happened, we saw this in New England with King Philip's War. We saw this with several wars in Virginia and other places as well, is the indigenous people would try to remove the now threatening military power and no longer have the power to do that. So that's one sort of pattern. Another sort of pattern is that repeatedly there would be treaties and agreements where the idea would be there's a line drawn somewhere and the settlers will stay on one side and the indigenous people will keep control of the land on the other side. But then settlers would cross the line and squat on indigenous land. And then typically what would happen is either the indigenous people would try to remove them, or they would sort of realize that that's not militarily feasible and their territory would just continue to shrink. And this is largely the process that resulted in indigenous people in the US and Canada now having very small pieces of reservation land that are still under their control. As far as contemporary cases of this, we might think of, for instance, Chinese policies in Xinjiang and Tibet, where they have a policy of having ethnic Chinese people move in to become the majority, to block secessionist movements. And there are similar things going on in places in India, Southeast Asia, other parts of the Americas, etc.
So, earlier in your description of your argument from your dissertation, you mentioned open and closed borders. Can you quickly explain what these are and how they differ?
Thanks. Yeah, so these are sort of technical terms in the philosophy of migration literature. So open borders is the view that while there will still be borders, people should almost always be allowed to cross them whenever they want and live in the world wherever they want. Usually people add very minimal caveats. One that's relevant now is, for instance, quarantine, right? Restricting the spread of infectious diseases, sort of issues of capping the number of population in a certain place, maybe. People on the open borders side often say things like, well, you don't have to permit invading armies. But the idea is that in general, people should be able to go and live wherever they want. And then closed borders is just not open borders. It's in some sense a misleading name because most of the advocates for this kind of position, people like Kit Wellman, David Miller, actually are proponents of increasing the amount of immigration that's permitted by various states. But the view is that states have a right to stop certain people from immigrating. So if we wanted a more accurate name, we could maybe call it something like controlled borders. But the name closed borders, which gives this sort of problematic implication of, fortress states, fortress Europe, this kind of thing, is the one that's taken over in the literature.
Now, Karl, if we could return to your dissertation, one of the things that I find so fascinating about your dissertation is that you seem to be doing something very new, which is that you're giving an argument against open borders, but which is socially progressive almost. Usually you would associate closed borders arguments with being socially conservative. You're almost giving a closed border argument which is socially progressive. So can you say a bit more about it?
Yeah, thanks. So that's definitely my goal. My sort of diagnosis of a lot of this literature is that people come to open borders as in some ways, very laudable overreaction to the anti-immigrant right. And there's a tendency for people to react to people like Trump or Boris Johnson and their demonization of immigrants by saying, oh no, well, not only should we not build the wall, but anybody should be able to cross the border. And so what I want to do is to say that, well, it's not as wide-ranging a claim that borders in general are oppressive, but rather the role that borders play is sometimes a very important one that protects people from domination, depending on context. And of course, they can be oppressive as well. Sorry, go ahead.
We should probably define what domination is for you.
So when I talk about domination, I use that term in the way it's used in the Republican, or sometimes called neo-Republican tradition of political thought. By the way, this is Republican with a small r, no relation to the American political party. So the classic definition here comes from Philip Pettit, that domination means being subjected to the arbitrary will of another. Or another could be person or group or collective agent. Now, what does this mean, being subjected to the arbitrary will of another? So the idea is that you're not free when there's someone else who can control you or do whatever they want to you or order you around, compel you to do things. So linguistically, domination comes from Latin dominus, which means a slave owner. This sort of theory goes back to the Romans. The idea is that you're not truly free if you have a master, if there's someone who can do all these things to you, basically do whatever they want. And that's true even if the person dominating you is benevolent and doesn't use their power, lets you do whatever they want, because whenever they feel like it, on their mere whim, they can stop being benevolent. And they can start doing whatever they want to you again. And of course, that affects the way that you have to interact with them, because always in the back of the relationship, there's this potential threat, right? So Republicans advocate a wide array of political institutions. The sort of core of the theory is that political institutions are supposed to prevent domination. That's the main purpose for political institutions. So we have things like laws and ways of enforcing them to prevent individual people from using violence against each other and taking each other's personal property and these sorts of things. Republicans advocate a social safety net, usually more extensive than the ones that most states have now, to try to prevent people from being forced by poverty to subject themselves to the will of other people. Different kinds of mechanisms to prevent the state from dominating citizens, things like elections, courts, where you can sue the government, the rule of law, different kinds of contestatory procedures. So then what I argue is that one of these kinds of political institutions that's important for preventing domination in a lot of contexts, particularly settler colonial contexts, is borders and the ability to control who crosses them.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Before we go on to talk about your preferred position, which is this kind of republicanist take on the border debate, can I just ask one more question about your critique of the open border position? And one of the criticisms you're making is that open borders arguments are implicitly endorsing settler colonialism through history, but also now. But it seems to me that it doesn't really matter if open borders arguments are endorsing actions that happened in the past.
Good. So there's a number of reasons we might care about this. One reason is it might just matter for us to have good moral judgments about past actions, and this will inform the actions we take moving forward. Another sort of reason that, at least in the American context, matters is that these sort of moral judgments of what happened in the past affects things like indigenous land claims. So if certain kinds of settlement were wrongful, that's different than if the settlers had every right to go settle there and resistance to that settlement was wrongful. There's also this issue that at least in the American and also to some extent in other settler societies, a lot of political rights that are institutionalized for indigenous peoples come from treaties. And the treaties are usually things that are in exchange for permission for settlers to settle on certain lands that used to be controlled by the indigenous people. And so these treaties have often not been honored, but there are attempts to get them honored. There are attempts to get restitution for the failure to honor them. And there's a significant moral shift if you think about treaties as something that were extorted from the settler society in order to get the settlers to be allowed to do the thing that they had a moral right to do anyway, namely settle on indigenous lands, as opposed to if you think about them as something that were what the indigenous people managed to negotiate for in exchange for giving up their lands that they did not have a moral obligation to allow settlement on. Another reason that you might think it matters is that, so in general, if we have a principle, right? So there's this thing we do in political philosophy and ethics called reflective equilibrium. So we have a principle, and when we test the principle against cases, and then we have judgments about the cases, and we sort of use those to test the plausibility of the principle. And we also use the principle to help settle hard cases, and we sort of go back and forth, right? And if we're doing this process only with a certain subset of cases, the ones involving, say, contemporary US and Europe, and not thinking about other cases, well, our principle of open borders is going to maybe look pretty plausible. But then if we think about all the cases that this principle would have to apply to, if we're thinking this is a sort of universal ethical principle, it starts to look a lot less plausible when we think about these kinds of cases.
Okay, Karl. So earlier you described your argument as one of republicanism. What kind of objections have arisen when you've talked about republicanism with people?
Good. So there are a number of objections here. So one objection, well, obviously there are people who will just sort of double down on the open borders arguments. One thing that several people have said is, well, is the problem really domination? Maybe domination is okay, and the problem is that settler colonialism also often involves things like violence and people being forced off their lands. And there I would say that it matters a lot whether you think that the settlement that led to the violence was morally justified, because oftentimes it was the indigenous people that started the violence to remove people, right? And so it matters for assessing whether that was justified violence or not, which side who started the conflict was in the right. There's also another issue that people coming from an indigenous rights perspective and an anti-colonial perspective have often made an argument against republicanism that republicanism can justify certain kinds of colonialism because most of the prominent contemporary Republicans, like Philip Pettit, think that to secure non-domination from other people, you need a state. And of course, many indigenous societies didn't have a state, where a state in this definition is something like a coercive authority that's centralized. And so the argument that people like Patchen Markell and Robert Nichols make is that you can have a certain kind of argument that, well, we're, by incorporating people into a state, incorporating people into a state that has certain kinds of constitutional forms and, you know, the rule of law and these sorts of things, we're actually bringing non-domination to you. And so what I do to respond to that is to say that, first of all, whatever's actual is possible. And there are a number of cases of non-state societies that have done a pretty decent job in securing non-domination from other individuals without a state. So the main case I talk about is the Iroquois, but there are others as well. And then, of course, there's this issue of whether it actually follows from the fact that you don't have perfect non-domination, that someone can impose that on you. That raises a whole other can of worms as well. Or you might think of it as making the domination problem worse, right? Now, not only do you have domination from, say, other people in your society, but also from the colonial bureaucrats or the settler population or something like this. So there's sort of two reasons, I think, to resist this kind of argument.
Now, Karl, this issue in your dissertation must have ramifications for real life right now, right?
Hope so. If I could get as much publicity for the ideas I'm having as I like, what I hope would happen is that the conversation around philosophy of immigration changes to that people stop going to the sort of extreme of open borders and start talking more about certain contexts are oppressive or not, or in the way that borders are enforced and drawn. So, for instance, in the U.S. case, there's this whole issue of, over 12 million immigrants who are forced to live in the shadows and experience domination because they're undocumented, living in the United States. And so there's lots of reasons. There are issues of compensatory justice, given our past interactions with Latin America and the fact that the US government is responsible for a lot of the poverty that's leading people to immigrate, right? There's all kinds of ways of criticizing US immigration policy. I know less about it, but I imagine similar things could be said about EU and UK. So what I wish would happen is that people focused more on these particular problems with particular border regimes and less on trying to say that the border itself is the problem.
So you've managed to explain to us an area of philosophy which you really, really love. But what I'd really like to know is, what is one area of philosophy which really grinds your gears?
Well, I'm not going to throw any shade on whole areas. I do have an issue with this thing that we do where we're very narrow. We subspecialize, and we, at least in the Western tradition, only talk to other people in the Western tradition for the most part. And I think that's really deeply problematic if we think that what we're doing in philosophy is looking for the truth and trying to find out things like, what is a just society and how do societies justly interact with one another and what is the best way to live, and these kinds of questions. It would just be a miracle if Westerners found all the best answer to these and we didn't have important things to learn from the other traditions of philosophy that are out there. So I think the way the system is set up so that it's very difficult for people to learn even as much about other traditions as I have, and I'm no expert, is a really problematic structural problem in philosophy. There's an article published a few years ago in, I believe, the New York Times by Peter Adamson, who's a specialist in Islamic philosophy, and Brian Van Norden, who's a specialist in classical Chinese philosophy, arguing that philosophy departments in the English-speaking world need to rename themselves Western philosophy departments because that's, for the most part, all they are. And I think there's something that's really sadly true about that and needs to change.
I love that answer so much. I never saw it like that before. That it's so obvious actually that philosophy needs to be interdisciplinary within itself and even with other subjects if it's trying to get the truth, because being self-contained is never going to work. That's such a great point. Karl, thank you so much for joining us in conversation today. You've been amazing.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.
And to all of our listeners, join us next week for another episode of Thoughts. Remember to follow us if you're listening on Spotify, and remember to subscribe if you're on Apple Podcasts.